and formally welcome you to tonight's meeting. This is for the Chartwell community, and on behalf of the Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works, thank you for joining. My name is Rakia Nance, and I'm going to give a brief overview of tonight's presentation. First, I'd like to hand the show over to Kiana Ray, who will introduce the folks that will be talking to you this evening. I would also like to note that tonight's meeting will be recorded and made available on the Chartwell community page, and I'll explain how you can navigate there a little bit further down in the presentation. Kiana?
Thanks, Rakia. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to introduce the Department of Public Works team first. We have Don Bergerman, Kim Clooney, George Heiner, Julie Paluda, and myself, Kiana Ray. From our HDR team, we have Brian Balchunas, Ed Shea, Rakia Nance, who you just heard from, and Jessica Sneed. Thank you so much. Back to you, Rakia.
Thank you, Kiana. Tonight's meeting is hosted via WebEx, and I know that in this world of virtual meetings that we're all accustomed to different platforms. So I just wanted to give you an overview of the controls that you'll be using. We're encouraging you to ask questions throughout this presentation. We're going to be talking about a lot of information, and you can use the raise hand feature in WebEx if you have a question. And we also encourage you to use the chat function if you have a question.
I'm in there. That's me.
I'm also going to ask you all to mute if you're not speaking. And in the interest of bandwidth, we have quite a few people on the line tonight. So if you turn your cameras off, you're not presenting as well, that will help. We want to make sure that you are understanding the information that's presented. And further in tonight's presentation, we'll have a few poll questions that we hope you'll participate in answering to help us with our presentation. Here's an overview of what we'll be discussing tonight. First, we'll talk about the Our Water program as it relates to the Chartwell neighborhood. Then we'll discuss funding and cost. Then we'll chat a little bit about the enrollment and development process. And finally, next steps in Q&A. And although we have parsed out this Q&A section, again, we encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. And now I'll hand it over to George Heiner from the Department of Public Works.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Our Water program and the background of it. And basically, the Our Water program is a long-term strategy that Can Rikia, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Could you hear me from the beginning?
I could. It went out a little bit, but I can hear you.
Okay, sorry. So the Our Water program is an integrated program that the county's developed to maintain mostly our nutrient loads. It's really focused on the nitrogen loads to the Chesapeake Bay while strengthening water resiliency. Can you go to the next slide? So there's 5 elements to the Our Water program. One is what we call small system upgrades. These are small private wastewater treatment plants that the county is going to look at either taking over or assisting with upgrades to improve their treatment. There's the stormwater program, which is a very robust program that's funded through the stormwater fee. There's groundwater resiliency, where we're going to look at different options to support our aquifers. And there's wastewater treatment enhancements, which is the ongoing work we're doing at our wastewater plants for enhanced nutrient removal for nitrogen and phosphorus removal. And then what we're going to really be talking more about tonight is the septic to sewer connection program. So why is it beneficial to connect to public sewers? So from the main reason is that now that the county has invested in quite a bit over the last 10 years on upgrading their wastewater treatment plants, the performance of those facilities, particularly when compared with conventional septic systems, is much higher. So our typical wastewater treatment plant has about 90% less pollution than a typical septic system. And so there's a collective benefit if more locations switch from septic to the public sewer. Would you go to the next slide?
Nobody cares about that. They just want to know how much.
So the septic to sewer connection program is really what the county's developed is a more targeted approach to try to support septic connections through our traditional petition process. And this map is also the map that's on our water page that shows the areas that are highlighted as eligible areas. These are the areas in blue on this map. Can you go to the next slide? So we have a basic need that we would like to see more of our septic systems connected throughout the county to help improve the waterways and reduce the nutrient loads. We've developed a modified process to try to make it more affordable for communities to use, still going through the petition process. And our goal in this program is to try to convert 6,000 septic systems over the next 30 years. So that's approximately 200 homes per year. This community overall has the potential to be larger than that 200 home area. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that might mean going forward. And what's one other thing I'd mention is the county overall has 40,000 septic systems. So this program, the idea with developing the targeted program in the eligible areas was really to try to make it more affordable for people. And we really just need to make a dent in that existing number of septic systems that the county has. Can you go to the next slide? So I won't spend a whole lot of time on the background, but the county has been working for several years now on developing a new septic connection program. There was a septic task force in 2017 and 2018 where we had different, members from the public involved to talk about prioritization criteria and policies. This led to eventually new legislation being passed by the county council, which the two key things, and we're going to talk more about this later tonight, was the potential for the county to offer a subsidy on certain projects if you're in an eligible area, and for partial deferments of the annual assessment for properties in the eligible area. So at the present time, those code changes have been enacted, and this program we're developing an application process and trying to reach out to more communities to let them know about the program, and so hopefully people can consider the possibility for making a connection. Next slide, please. So I mentioned this a little bit before. The areas in this map are eligible. So the green is the planned service areas already in the county. The blue are eligible areas in the septic connection program. So those blue areas are all areas that are, even though they're in the county's planned service area, they're actually septic system areas. And the code defined the eligible area as a combination of a few factors. If an area is in an on-site wastewater management plan, if an area is in the critical area, or if an area is an area that DPW had already considered as a potential for a layout. And also if the area is close to the county's existing infrastructure. So the Chartwell area was really a mix of those last two factors. Because of the size of the area, we had looked at possible ideas for how it might be connected in the past. So we had some preliminary layouts for that. And there is a portion, at least the southern portion, which is somewhat close to the county's existing infrastructure. Could you go to the next slide, please? So this is the overall area that we had developed layouts for in the past. One of the areas, there's I think the small area in the center, there's like a gap has actually connected. I don't recall when, but these were the areas that we felt that could be connected. So this total area encompasses 920 properties, and there's actually 9 separate drainage areas. So if this were to proceed, if say the whole area were to connect, it would be done as a multi-year effort. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. This is somewhat unique because it's such a large area. It's also possible that the projects could go independently, because from the engineering standpoint, we're going to be focused more on the collection and transport of the septic or sewage within that drainage area. So that being said, generally there are economies of scale as the project gets larger. So a larger project is generally going to be lower in cost per household than smaller projects. And we'll talk a little bit more. Well, we can take questions when we get to a little break if there's questions about that. But in the way this process would work is that it's a voluntary process from the community side. So we're not planning to serve this whole area unless we have a request to do that through the petition process. Can you go to the next slide, please?
George, before you continue, I just want to remind everyone to put yourself on mute, please. Thank you.
So this is a subset of the other drawing, and it just shows how that the possible layout for this area is sort of to the eastern side of the golf course. So you can go to the next slide again. And this is a little bit more of a subdivision of the possible areas. And we have, for each of these, we have conceptual layouts of how we think the area could be served. And we've done that several years ago when we were trying to really start understanding the level of effort that might be involved to connect septic systems.
You have it on mute.
So when we're showing this, these areas, that's where those basic layouts are coming from. Do you want to go to the next slide? Yeah. Okay, here's another area towards the southeast. One thing that's a little different here is these properties can all connect by gravity, so there's no need for a pumping station. And then the next slide. Okay, so that's all of the little sub areas. We're going to stop at different points for questions. So, I mean, if there's any questions right now about, I guess, our water program or why we're trying to encourage septic connections, or some of the project area information that we just showed, we'd encourage anyone to ask any questions now. The next portion of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit more about the costs and what kind of costs we expect in this area. Okay, so if there's not any questions right now, I'm going to hand it off to our consultant team, who's speaking for HDR tonight.
George, it's me, Brian.
Brian, I'm going to, sorry.
How do you ask a question? I unmuted myself. May I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
This is Sheila. Did I hear correctly that you said it's a voluntary commitment? I assume on the part of the community as opposed to an individual.
Yeah, so we'll talk a little bit about that now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about this later in the presentation. But the process where you would eventually be connected is the county's petition process. And in the petition process, the community is sending a petition to the county saying we are requesting that the county extend public service to this area, and there's a map included with that, and all the property owners have to signal at the initial part, are they supportive of the petition or not? And if 50% of them support it, then the county moves forward and does a schematic design report. It presents the preliminary engineering results, and then there's another vote, there's a formal vote at that time. And if 50% of the community, the majority, moves ahead, at that point, it's mandatory for everybody in that project area.
Okay.
Okay, so it's voluntary on the community level, and the county's not going to define boundary. But once the majority vote to connect within a project area, the connection is mandatory at that point.
Thank you. Thank you.
And George, there is one more question about the Chartwell area. Could you clarify which streets or areas in Chartwell have already been hooked up to public sewer?
I
think we may need to get back to you on that, unless Brian.
mean, there's some. If you go back a couple slides, Rakia.
Okay.
To the map that showed the southern portion.
Yeah, I don't remember the street name there.
No, too forward, Rakia.
It's probably on Sheffield Road.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the exact road. They're
No, it's Wembley Way.
kind of on the
Yeah.
on the south side off of Benfield. There are some areas that have already connected. So
that if you go back a couple slides, it's like the hole in the area, right? If you're looking at it
completely,
yeah. You go back maybe 3 or 4 slides. There we go. There you can kind of see that area. So those were just a couple individual streets. It looks like Benfield Road.
Yeah, it's off of Benfield Road, that area to the south there.
I believe it's like the last 3 streets that were built in Chartwell, Highfield being one of the names, and I don't remember the other 2. And they're very close.
To Kinder, across from Kinder Park.
They're close to Kinder and Jumpers Hole. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, it's Wembley Way, the last section that they built.
That was section 3.
Yes.
And it's the end of Wembley Way as it winds around for Chartwell people, as it winds around and goes to Kinder, and it takes in like 2 or 3 little cul-de-sacs. It's that very last stretch going to Kinder Road. That's what I understand. It's the last section of the community that was built in 1990s, I think. Okay, bye.
We have a question about eligibility, and the question is, what about residents who are not part of the Chartwell community? This person lives on Weybridge Circle and is in the Gravity area. Would this person be able to connect if the rest of Chartwell decides not to?
So there has to be a contiguous string of properties from the county's existing infrastructure to wherever you are in the project area. And everything in this, the blue boundary for the purposes of our water program is in an eligible area. And that's not because it's part of Chartwell or not part of Chartwell. It's because we had looked at this years ago and decided this looked like an area that we could provide public service to. So I'm not sure if that exactly answers the question, but I mean, yes, you could go forward without the other areas, except that you still have to be able to there has to be a contiguous row of properties along the route of the project to get to the county's existing infrastructure.
And George, I'll add that we'll post these slides to the community webpage and give you a link to the community webpage. And at the back end of these slides is each of those 9 drainage areas that George talks about. So those are laid out from an engineering perspective of what makes sense, but each one of those 9 drainage areas, or a combination of those 9 drainage areas, can be part of a application for this program, and we'll talk about the application process a little bit later. But yeah, it does not need to be all 920 properties. And if I'm looking at a map correctly, the areas off of Benfield that are not connected to the south, that may not necessarily be part of Chartwell, yes, they can submit an application independently.
Yeah. So I see a question in the chat about the percentage needed to pass and how many people will be voting, how much per home is it estimated will it cost, and how long is the process. So we're going to talk on the cost. Brian's going to talk about that in more detail in just a few minutes, so I'm going to hold off on that answer. We're also going to talk more about the conversion process, but I can tell you it's years, and we'll go over that a little more. In terms of the percentage needed to pass, in terms of the petition process, the code says it's a majority need, or the majority need to approve. So that's 50%. The number of homes is determined by the petition that's submitted by the community. So it could be a petition of 20 homes, it could be a petition of 200 homes. That's up to the community. But it is important to understand that that majority in favor, when you're in the petition process, that majority is then sort of compelling the minority in the area to do the connection. So I don't want to gloss over that. It can be contentious for some communities. So it's great to communicate with the other areas to get an understanding of who's in favor and where their thoughts are about it.
And then the last question that we got via chat was, where would pumping stations potentially be located?
Well, as we went to generally when we were first laying these out, we looked for areas that were in relatively low spots and where there looked like there could be some open ground. So if we were moving forward with these projects, we'd have to do more detailed evaluation of possible site locations, and where we need to, we'd have to see if we can acquire easements for the property. I think, Brian, do our more blown up maps, do they show potential pump station? Okay, so
yes.
On the enhanced scale map that Brian's referring to, there is a general indication, but I don't want to overemphasize that too much. We haven't talked to any property owners anywhere. These were conceptual layouts that we did several years ago, just figuring out, did it look like there was possibility to collect sewage and pump it out? So.
Okay, and one more question regarding the petition process. Chartwood and Chartwell are separate communities. Are they not on one petition?
They could file separate petitions, or they could file a combined petition. From the perspective of the petition process, it doesn't have to follow the community boundary, or it could be a subset, honestly, of one of those communities also.
And as the layouts that were previously done are based on topography and where the existing sewer is and all of those things. They are not defined at all by community boundaries. So there may be some of these drainage areas that cut right through the middle of a community, and if that portion of the homes wanted to go it alone, they could do so.
Okay, thank you all so much for your questions. We're going to proceed to talk about the funding and costs of this project.
So start off with kind of what defines a project. Obviously, you all are in a built-up community with the majority on existing septic. So there are really three components to the per property cost to connect. The first and the biggest piece is the overall project cost. So that is the cost to construct the local sewer system. So that's in the public right-of-way, includes the collection sewers, the pump stations, the force mains, et cetera. That is the bulk of the costs here. And unfortunately, in built-up communities like yours, it's expensive to tear up the streets and dig up the sewer. And some of these sewers are 10 to 15 to 20 feet deep, so they need to be installed in that existing infrastructure. So the county's project would take the sewer up into a clean out that would be right at the property line of the home. And then there are private on-site costs, and these are the costs to get the sewer to that clean out. Also, you would need to abandon your existing septic system. So the cost for the abandonment, and we'll get a little bit more into what these costs are typically and how they might be funded. And then the third piece in green is the capital facility connection charge, and that is the cost to pay for essentially the county's existing infrastructure and facilities that the sewage would go to for treatment. So the investments the county has previously made. So touch a little bit, go to the next slide, Ricky, on the project cost. So this is the bulk of the cost. And if we look at this per household or per property, there's quite a wide range of costs. And the major contributors to those project costs are the property sizes, the denser the community, the lower the average cost would be, the proximity to the existing system, how deep those sewers are, whether you need to install a grinder pump to get it to a sewer collection system, if a pump station is required, how much surface restoration is required, street closures, et cetera. And if we look at those 9 drainage areas in Chartwell, some of those to the south that are right next to the existing sewer will have a lower cost. Some that require kind of in the interior that might require a pump station and a longer force main to connect to the existing sewer would have a higher average cost. So there's quite a wide range of potential costs in Chartwell, from about the mid $30,000 per property to about $70,000 per property. The median kind of falls within the median of all the areas that the county has looked at. And we'll talk about how this translates to an assessment here in a little bit. Next slide. Then the private on-site costs traditionally would be paid out of pocket by a homeowner, and we'll talk about potential other funding sources for this in a minute. But traditionally, most of the time, these fall below 4,000 to 6,000. But you'll see in the historical, these are based on information from the health department on previous people who have connected. And you'll see there is a kind of little bump on the higher side for these property costs. And those higher side are typically very large properties that may have to run an expensive line to get to the right of way and the clean out connection. Just large property sizes overall. If there are topography issues on your property that you would have to go deep for your own sewer or look at other alternative construction means. And if you had significant property or driveway restoration that would need to be done. So in the most cases and in the smaller size lots, we would expect it to be towards the left on this curve. So as I said, we'll talk about how that translates, what the funding sources are, and how this will translate into potential assessments and potential yearly costs here next. But before we go there, just see if there are any questions on what defines the project cost. Okay, let's keep going then on funding sources. So as George mentioned, one of the differences now on this program is that the county has enacted legislation to help pay for this. And so the county has offered a subsidy, and that's the intent of this program, to find interested, eligible areas to apply for getting the subsidy, and the subsidy will be up to 25% of the total project costs. There are also state funds available. The Bay Restoration Fund is available for use, and this BRF fund could be used to can be applied to pay for those private costs. So there are funds available from the Bay Restoration Fund to pay for those costs, and we'll talk about how that some of the assumptions we're making on the funds available from the state. And then the homeowner would be responsible for the remaining cost, and this would be through an annual assessment. I see a question in the chat of how often the payment would be. And this payment would be annually. The bill would come every January for payment of the assessment. We'll talk about how that assessment is calculated. The county is also looking to take advantage of low interest state loans to reduce the homeowner annual costs. This is through a state revolving loan fund that is applied for once a year. We know there are granting low interest loans, which would reduce that annual assessment through that state revolving loan fund project.
And Brian, there's one more question in the chat. What is the cost to get an estimate for a property?
I assume that means an estimate for those private side costs. Assuming that that would be through, so the way the private side costs work is you have to hire a master plumber to do that work. and they would be the ones to provide an estimate. I don't think they would charge you for an estimate, but I'm not certain. And again, the state BRF funds are available to pay for some of those private site costs, or potentially all of those private site costs. And the way that works is you would obtain quotes from master plumbers, I think 3 plumbers, and provide those to the county, and then the county would reimburse the plumber directly using straight state BRF funds.
So there's a question in the chat about whether the payment term 3, 5, or 7 years. We'll talk a little bit more about that, but the public side assessment would be over a 40-year period. And the last question was discussing a site-specific, I guess, conditions at an individual site. So yes, if you go back to the chart of the private side costs, depending on the topography of the site where your septic system is, it can be costly for your on-site costs. Yes. I think that's really the reason there's sort of a bump on the second part, is that, depending, and when we say topography, a lot of times there's, that the road is upstream or uphill, and the house is maybe further down the slope, or the house is significantly set back from the road, and all of that increases the on-site cost, because the county connection will be a sewer cleanout that's put at the edge of the right-of-way, at the edge of the public right-of-way. So the homeowner is responsible for any costs associated with anything around their house, in their house, decommissioning the septic tank, and then getting the line out to the cleanout that the county installs.
Okay, thank you for your question. We're moving on through the funding discussion.
So a little bit more on the project subsidy. So the subsidies are awarded based on a ranking system. So as George said, the county's looking to do about 200 properties per year. So some of the projects may need to be staggered over time to meet the available funding, and that's part of the reason for the ranking system, is to be sure that the funds are available. The ranking system is based on a multitude of factors that we'll talk about later. Then once a area has been granted the subsidies, as I said earlier, it's up to 25% of the per project cost, property costs. There is income tests for this, so these match the state BRF requirements. So for incomes less than $300,000 per year, you get that full subsidies. And for income greater than $300,000 per year, or if you don't want to prove your income, you would get half of the total subsidies. And the subsidies are used to reduce that total assessment. Next slide. The Bay Restoration Fund grant program, this is, as I said, potential assistance with those private on-site costs. And if there's money left over, it can also be applied to that capital facility connection charge. This funding would, if it's used for the on-site and CFCC charges, would be administered through the health department. It could be up to $20,000. Again, it has the same income test that I just spoke about. So less than $300,000 could be eligible for up to $20,000, and more than $300,000 would be half of that. The state funding for this program is limited each fiscal year. And as I said previously, it's not provided directly to you. It's payments are made to the master plumber. The county is working with the state and MDE to try to maximize BRF funding here, not only for these private on-site costs and CFCC, but also looking at additional funding to try to reduce the overall assessment. So if we look at costs, and this is the project cost, that big piece of the pie that you saw earlier, the costs are built up. So there's the actual construction cost to do the work. So this is the contractor installing the sewer and the manholes and the pump station, et cetera, restoring the roads, the cost for doing all that. And the county has other costs on top of that, though. There are investigations needed, site investigations, survey, easements, plats, design, inspection of the contractor's work, the overhead that the county incurs. And that's the total project cost, and that's the per property project cost I showed earlier. And then the county calculates the net assessable amount, which is those project costs. If for some reason it's a part of the community, for example, that a future community would connect into, and that necessitated making things bigger for that future connection, the county would deduct that future connection costs, deduct the state subsidy or the county subsidy, or any state grants that would apply to the assessment, plus the county incurred interest. And again, if this is a low interest state loan, that interest would be lower. That creates the net assessable amount. And then the assessment is that net assessable amount divided by the number of households in the area. And I think one other key point to make here, and I think we saw a question come through our water website, is this is per property now. It is not a front foot assessment, so it's just per property. And the program is set up over a 40-year term.
Yeah, so I just want to follow up on what Brian was saying. Is it looks like there's public water through a good deal of the community, and so one of the other changes to the petition process was a change from the front foot assessment to a per property assessment. So the way the assessment is calculated is a little bit different than it would have been if you'd done a water petition in the past.
And there is a question in the chat. The question is, would the project cost be competitively bid?
Yeah, I can answer.
They would follow. Go ahead, George.
So yes, the county would follow its standard procurement procedures. So we'd have a competitive technical and price proposals for the design, and then we get the also for the inspection contract, and also for the construction contract. There was a question I see about where would the connection point be, where on the property line. So the clean out itself is on the private property, right beyond the right of way. Where within your property, like along your frontage, say, the county can work with the homeowner on that, on the best location. What we would normally recommend is that you talk to a master plumber, and they're taking a look at your house, and they're getting familiar with what the county's planning to do with the sewer line, and at that point you decide where it makes sense for you.
And then a couple more questions, one relating to easements for pumping stations. How much square footage would be needed for that, taken from a privately owned property?
So that answer depends about mostly on the size of the station. And and I guess the area around it. So we have stations on very small footprints. We would need to kind of look at that on a case by case basis. That one's a little difficult to answer as a general question.
All right. And then another question is there a lien put on the property for these costs?
I'm going to defer to a little later in the discussion. We're going to have some people from the county's utility assessments group talk, and they'll give you a more accurate response to that.
And then lastly, there's a request to repeat why transitioning from septic to public sewer is a good thing.
So the transition is a good thing because the county's publicly owned treatment plants are very efficient at removing nitrogen, in particular from wastewater. And most of our facilities are removing up to 90% of the nitrogen. We just went through at least a 10-year program to upgrade all the wastewater plants to what's called enhanced nutrient removal. And a conventional septic system does not actually remove much nitrogen. There's systems out there called nitrogen removing units, NRUs. They remove about 50% of nitrogen. Those are septic systems. So the overall benefit is the more septic systems that we can get connected and sent to the public treatment system, the more efficient the nitrogen removal is going to be, and the overall health of the local waterway and the bay as a whole.
And I would add, George, that the potential additional benefits, as you just mentioned towards the end there, is improved local waterway health for things other than nitrogen as well, that traditional septic systems do not remove. And then, it does, you are responsible for maintaining your existing septic system, so that responsibility would go away. There would be no maintenance of the septic system. And lastly, one other is, oftentimes you may be constrained on home additions or other things that because of a septic system or a failing septic system, and being on public sewer would relieve any of those constraints. You still have to go through the process of getting permits.
Question going back to pumping stations. How disruptive are they? The noise, is there odor? And will they continue to operate during power outages?
So I can probably take this one. So during construction, they would be probably disruptive to people who were nearby. Most of the stations have what's called a wet well, which is a large underground tank where the which would eventually flow into, so that the connecting gravity sewers would all come to wherever the pump station is location. For smaller pump stations, we use what's called the submersible pump station, and in those instances, the pumps are inside this wet well. But still, there's depending on the topography, of course, there's a bit of excavation that can be involved and some heavy equipment when that's going on. Once the work is done and the project is complete, it's not particularly disruptive at that point. County operations staff come by on a regular schedule to check things out. In terms of noise, I would say probably a very similar answer. During construction, there's noise, construction-related activities. Once the project is done, there shouldn't be as much of a noise issue. We have a few fans in some situations that run. And if they present a nuisance to the neighbors, we can try to take some mitigation measures for that. There's usually, there's always a generator installed at our newer facilities, and that will run during power outages. So there's a test, I believe, once a week of the generators. There's a little bit of noise during the day, once a week from that. And with respect to the odor control, we do provide odor control as a feature of the stations, but I won't say that there's no odor at a particular station. We do the best we can to manage that and respond to any issues that people may have about that.
Okay, and then one more question before we move on to the next portion. I was going back to septic systems and nitrogen. And the question is, if we have a good septic system and the tank contents are taken to the water treatment plant regularly, how is nitrogen a problem?
So there's nitrogen in the septic tank effluent. So the septage that goes to the treatment plant is it's the solid matter that settles to the tank, and it doesn't really degrade as readily. And so that septage is hauled to the treatment plants and it's treated there. But there's also soluble forms of nitrogen, mainly ammonia, that will go out into the drain field along with the rest of the septic tank effluent. So what happens at our major wastewater plants is that that ammonia comes in with the incoming sewage, and the treatment plants are designed to oxidize that ammonia into nitrate and then to remove that nitrate biologically. So the treatment plants have an engineered process for using microbial activity to remove the nitrogen that's in there. In the conventional septic system, it doesn't really have that feature. The nitrogen reducing septic systems, the NRUs, they are modified to do those kinds of features on a small scale. They'll have chambers to keep things mixed. They'll have aeration so that certain bugs need, they're not really bugs, but the microbes, they need oxygen to do certain processes. So I hope that answers the question.
I think one point, George, there that to make clear is the septic. There always is a septic tank effluent to your drain field, and that's what we're talking about, where the nitrogen is in that septic tank effluent, and that effluent will migrate to groundwater and to the closest water body, and that's what transfers it into the local waterways.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you all again for your questions. And we're going to continue on with the presentation and discuss our assessment basis assumptions.
So the assessment, the ultimate assessment that you'll vote on will be determined at a later date, but based on some of the engineering, the conceptual engineering that's already been done, we're able to calculate kind of a range of potential assessments to share with you. And I'll share that on the next slide, but just to give you some of the assumptions is here we are assuming that we get some money from the state to lower the assessment. So we're assuming $5,000 per property from the state to lower the assessment. We're assuming for those with income less than $300,000 a year that you get a 25% county subsidy. And then the one thing we haven't touched on is deferment. So the other code change that George mentioned previously is that you also in these areas have the option to defer up to 50% of the total assessment costs. And we'll talk about how that deferment it's a deferment, not a subsidy, so it does require a repayment. We'll talk about that repayment here in a little bit, but it would lower your initial annual cost to defer. There was existing code and still is existing code language that allows property owners to defer 100% for certain elderly, low income, or permanently disabled. And we'll talk about what that 100% deferment means here in a minute as well. And then we assume that about $15,000 would be available to fund your on-site costs and CFCC. So we're assuming $20,000 total from the state, $15,000 to you, and then $5,000 to defer the assessment. More than $300,000 a year, as I mentioned previously, the BRF and the county subsidy would be cut in half. And then for vacant lots, these are not eligible for subsidy or deferment or BRF for on-site costs. There wouldn't be any on-site costs. Vacant lots are required to pay the assessment. They obviously would not have any usage charges or connection charges, but they are required to pay for the assessment. So looking, and again, Chartwell is a broad area with a big range of costs. So, these are, the ranges here are quite large, but just to give you a perspective of what the yearly homeowner costs would be. And I want to emphasize these yearly costs include both the usage charge. So you will get a bill if you have water already now, similar to your water bill. Your usage would be based on your water consumption, but there would be a sewer bill associated with that water consumption. We estimate that the average bill is about $105 a quarter or $420 a year. So that $420 a year is in these comparisons, and then also the assessment. So just with a subsidy only, we're looking at a yearly homeowner cost after the subsidy of about $1,800 to $3,000 per year. If you take that deferment, that 50% deferment, that would drop to about $1,100 to $1,600 per year. And then the 100% deferment, you're still responsible for paying that usage charge of the $420 per year. And you can see here what that translates to for the higher incomes as well. Next slide. So some of the assessment options, again, the homeowner private costs, working to get as much as possible from the Bay Restoration funds, but anything that's remaining, you would be responsible for at the time of connection. The capital facility connection charge, any remaining Bay Restoration funds can be used to pay for that. You can pay it off if there's capital facility connection charge remaining, 100% at the connection, or it can be financed over the 40 years as part of the annual payments. And the graph we showed on the previous slide includes financing portions of those capital facility connection charge. And then the assessment itself is paid off annually. There's no ability to pay this up front because the county is taking out the loans to do the work and has to repay those loans. As I said, you can defer up to 50%, and that deferment would be due at the transfer of the property or at the end of the 40 years. And I'm going to ask Ron Briggerman to talk a little bit more about that deferment. So, Ron.
Good evening, Brian. You have Julie Polluted tonight.
Oh, sorry, Julie.
That's okay. We are we're spreading the task tonight. Good evening, everyone. My name is Julie Polluted. I'm the finance manager with the Bureau of Utility Operations with the Department of Public Works. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about the deferral repayment program. On this slide, we're talking about the partial deferral repayment. The partial deferral of up to 50% of the per property assessment and the capital facility connection charge is available to all owners of residential property with existing improvements. For example, if the total per property assessment is $68,000 over 40 years, up to $34,000 of the assessment costs can be deferred until the property is sold or 40 years, whichever occurs first. This could bring your yearly assessment down to $850 per year from $1,700. If the property is sold before the 40-year assessment period is over, you would need to repay the deferred $34,000, and the remaining annual assessment of $850 would be paid by the new buyer. Next slide. Under the full deferral repayment, the full deferral of the assessment payments is available, as mentioned before, for disabled and elderly residents as stated in county code who meet certain eligibility requirements. The full deferral defers each annual assessment until the property is transferred. At the time of transfer, all deferred payments are due. The remaining assessments would be paid by the new buyer. Next slide. So here on this slide is an example of the two different programs. In this example, we are assuming an annual payment of $1,700 based on a per property assessment of $68,000. The 50% deferral is available to all residential homeowners in the project area. The full deferral is available, as I mentioned before, to elderly and disabled residents who meet the certain criteria. In the case of the full deferral, the required payment at the time of the property transfer depends on when the property is transferred. For example, if transferred after 5 years, the deferral amount due is $8,500. If transferred after 10 years, $17,000 would be due. After 15 years, $25,500 would be due. After 20 years, $34,000 would be due. For the partial deferral, $34,000 would be due at the time the property is transferred, regardless of the number of years.
I do want to pause here. There have actually been quite a few questions over the past few minutes relating to a few different topics. Going back to the pumping stations, the question is, where would the pumping stations likely be located? Would that possibly be the inner part of the neighborhood?
So the location is generally noted on at least conceptually where we thought they could go on some of the other maps that we had shown. And I think, Brian, you said those will be on our community webpage, on the Our Water page, and we'll talk about how to get there a little bit later today. Where it's located in terms of the neighborhood, with respect to the neighborhood, is just going to be a function of the topography of the area. So when we tried to lay these out from a conceptual engineering standpoint, we really looked at where could we get the gravity flow of sewage to the extent that we can, to a low point in an area. So in some cases that may be in the inner part of a community, in some cases it's on the periphery of the community. So it really depends on the topography of a particular area as to where it would be.
And then there are a few questions going back to nitrogen. The question is, why not treat the dry wells leading off the septic system with nitrogen additives?
So, there are methods for individual homeowners to modify their septic systems to remove nitrogen. I'm not totally familiar with the option that's being described in this circumstance, but there are ways for homeowners to do that. Generally, those systems require more maintenance by the homeowner, but that's something for the homeowner to consider. In terms of the overall intent of our program, septic systems are a large component of Anne Arundel County's nitrogen load to the Chesapeake Bay. And so what we're trying to do through this program is to see if we can get more locations to connect. And in that way, we'll reduce the overall nitrogen load from septic systems. But there are ways that nitrogen can be removed. And ultimately, we wouldn't want to discourage anybody from looking at those, even if the community doesn't go forward with a septic connection. We would encourage everyone to look into nitrogen removing units for your own properties, because that would also help with reducing nitrogen loads.
All right.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Rikia.
Sure. After construction of the public system, how long can homeowners continue using an existing functioning private septic system?
So in the county code, once the system is what we call released for service, so once it's been installed and everything's been tested, all owners in the project area have to connect within 9 months. So you're not allowed to run your existing system to failure. There's some limited exceptions if you had just recently installed a new system, but for the large majority, it's going to be 9 months that you have to make the connection.
Okay. Next question has to do with cost. If you have an irrigation system and then water your yard, your costs go way up. Those who have public sewage in Chartwell have limited their lawn watering.
So if I want to put this one in the context. So this project that this program that we're talking about is for septic connections and for the septic system. So if you're on public water right now, the water restrictions on using the water for irrigation purposes are because you would be on public water. If your house was connected, let's say you were on a private drinking water well right now, and you connected to public water, you would need to decommission your private drinking well. Our water program and the focus of the septic connection program is not related to the provision of public water. So there wouldn't be a restriction on the use of your own. If you had a private drinking well and public sewer, there wouldn't necessarily be a restriction on the use of your private drinking well related to your public sewer connection. It would be if you were on public sewer as well as public water, then there could be an emphasis on if you were making that connection, you would have been required to decommission your private drinking well. And then, yes, you could get notifications about trying to reduce usage during hot periods like we're seeing right now.
I think the question is more related to if you're on both public water and public sewer and you water your lawn, you're paying sewage charges because your water's being metered. And that's what your sewage charge is based on.
I misunderstood. Okay.
I can jump in here on this one. And for the most part, yes, there is a one-time adjustment that's done each year based off of if you are exceeding in those summer billing months, if you're exceeding your normal water usage by a certain percentage, that there is a credit for the wastewater portion of that increase.
Okay, next question having to do with the deferral. Is the original owner responsible for all costs?
So the way that if you do the deferral, you would pay off, if you sold the house, you would pay off the deferred amount. So in the example that we had given in deferring $34,000, when that house is transferred, that $34,000 has to be paid off. Of the other half of that assessment, for the time that you would be living in the house, you would pay that annual assessment each year. Once you sold the house, the next owner would pay that same assessment for the remainder of the 40 years. So if you owned the house for 10 years, you would make that assessment for 10 years, and then the next person would make that assessment for 30 years.
And then related to that, could you clarify if the current owner will be responsible for at least half of the upfront cost?
Could you go back, Ricky, a few slides to the comparison of the two deferments? I think it might be easier. Kim,
Yeah.
Julie, I'll let you guys answer it, but I think that slide might be more helpful.
Which slide was it?
It's the one with the table that shows the two deferments.
I think 31 might be an easier one to show.
Okay.
So what this one is showing here is the total over 40 years would be $68,000. That would be a roughly $1,700 each year. If you deferred half of it, then that $34,000 would be due at the time that the house transfers. Each yearly assessment would be $850 a year. But once that house is sold, you would need to pay off $34,000, the amount that was deferred, the 50%. And then that yearly assessment of $850 would be charged to the next owner, to the person who bought the house, for the remainder of that amount of time.
Okay, thank you. And again, related to cost, not deferral, but just cost in general, did we already address how much each homeowner would pay on average for wastewater on their quarterly water bill?
Brian, I think you talked about that a little bit. Could you?
Yeah, that's in the annual cost. It's assumed $105 per quarter or $420 a year. That is what the county charges. County calculates as an average usage, and that's what they charge people on sewer who do not have public water. Again, if you have public water, it would be metered, and so you would pay the usage, not the flat rate. But the average is assumed at $105 per quarter.
And the last question before we move on to the enrollment and development process, what if you have a pool? How does this impact that?
If you have an existing pool, I don't think there would be much impact on this. Where we see the question of the pools come up more often is if, sometimes a homeowner may be interested in a pool, but they can't build one because their drain field occupies a significant portion of their yard. And so in that circumstance, making a public connection, then you would no longer have the septic system or the drain field. But I think if you have an existing pool, I don't know why that would necessarily impact your existing pool. The question about if the slides would be available for viewing. So yes, we'll talk about this a little later. There's a community webpage that we have set up, and we'll show you the link. Ricky will show you the link to that a little later. We have the slides that we're presenting tonight, and we're also going to post a recording of this meeting, so you can listen from the beginning if you started a little bit late.
All right, we can move on to discuss enrollment and development process.
George, before we
Yeah.
move on from there,
Sure. Yes.
can I address the pool because they're asking additional questions on the pool?
So, okay, yes.
So the way that the if you do fill your pool, that would also be subject to that excess use credit, where if your quarterly amount of water use goes up significantly for one quarter, I believe it's the first billing quarter after April 30th, that they would deduct what that difference is. So if it's 110% above the average of the previous 3 quarters, your wastewater is reduced by 50% of that amount over 110%. So there is an adjustment that would go on if you are filling your pool during that time.
Okay, so now we're going to step through the enrollment and development process, and this is really going to walk through kind of where things are right now, and then up through the formal petition process. So, as we mentioned, the subsidy part of the new program is intended for so the county's going to financially support some of these projects to make them more affordable. And we're targeting 200 a year, but we really don't have the resources to offer subsidies to as many communities that express interest in any given year. So what we've developed is an application and ranking system, and what we're going to be encouraging communities to do is, if they think they're interested, to send us an application for an area, and we will review it and rank it compared to other applications that we receive during this application cycle. So the first step in the process is where we are now, which is a pre-application information meeting. And we've set this up. We've had different public outreach efforts to let people know about the program. I believe there was a county executive, was it a press release about it? And then the webpage itself, there's an ourwater.org webpage, has been in place for probably six months or more. And we've received interest from different people within this community. So what we're doing is, when we've gotten interest from people in the community and it's an area that we know is either an eligible area or one that we have layouts that we've already developed, we're trying to reach back out to those communities and just explain the process and how it works. There's no requirement in terms of at the pre-application stage. This is just an information meeting. It's not binding in any way on the community. And again, the only reason that we're reaching out to this community is because there were several people that expressed interest, and we knew from our studies that this was an area that had a lot of potential for septic connections. So we're presenting information tonight about the process and the costs. That step 2 would really be for neighborhoods within the community to discuss whether they're interested, and maybe which areas might be interested. If there is interest, our next step, and we'll talk a little bit more in detail about that, would be to send us an application. And the application is pretty simple. It's a community. We ask for a community representative to be designated, a map of a proposed project area that we'll work with you to develop, and some expression of interest. And we'll talk about that a little bit more coming up. Once we do that, we'll do a conceptual layout, and we'll have a second meeting with the community to refine these costs and the specific project area. And at that point, the community would decide whether they want to submit a formal petition or not. So the formal petition is you'd be contacting our utility assessments group, and there's petition forms, and everyone in the proposed project area gets notified. Once a petition is validated, DPW does what's called a preliminary engineering study, a schematic design report. We come up with much more refined layouts and costs, and then we will present back to the community a formal petition vote, which would be presenting the assessment estimate at that time. So that's really the formal binding process. Really starts with step 4. If the community votes to proceed with the petition, the majority in favor, then we move to final design and construction, and at that point, everyone has to connect that's in that project area. So if we want to go to the next slide.
George, before we move on to the next slide, may I ask you to clarify step 1? There's a question from a resident saying, if we're on step 1, who requested this? I don't recall any polling of homeowners in our community.
So in terms of, I can tell you we received inquiries from several residents. I don't have the specific information about who. In terms of step 1, I mean, our interest is letting different communities know about the program and the costs and the process. If the community submits an application, at that point, we're asking for some expression of interest. That could be either a letter from a community association or an HOA or some sort of poll that the community has taken that lets us know that there seems to be some interest in at least submitting an application and seeing if the community would be offered a subsidy. So at the step 1, really we're just seeing where we get some responses from different communities, and we're trying to schedule outreach meetings to let people know about the program. In step 2, with an application, what we're looking for as an expression of interest was, let's say in this community, we're not necessarily, if 5 people tell us they're interested out of 600, that doesn't really tell us that there's any real level of interest in the community beyond the 5 people that contacted us. So, we're looking for a little bit more of an understanding that people are at least interested enough to file the application. And that's why we're presenting as much detail as we can at this point, so people can understand what the cost might be and whether that seems reasonable or not, I guess.
Okay, and related to this, the question, when and how is the vote conducted in step 4? And George, I know you've got some slides that speak to this in detail a little bit.
So can we look at the next slide, Rakia? If we don't cover this adequately, we'll certainly come back to it. Okay, so this is a little more detail of the formal petition process. So in the formal petition process, the community is, so there's a petition that has a map associated with it, defines all the properties. And all the property owners are sent a form, and they can indicate whether they're in favor of the petition or not in step 1 of the petition process. Okay, and that's just telling the county that you're interested in the petition and finding out what the assessment would be. The DPW will do the preliminary engineering study and will develop more detailed costs of some of these questions about where would we propose to put a pump station, what would the footprint be for the pumping station. We'll work out more of those details in this step 2 of a petition. In step 3, we'll have a public hearing. So that's a formal public hearing, and that will be advertised in advance. People will have opportunity to express their opinions or ask questions. The format will be a little bit like this, but it is a required public hearing as part of the code. After that, there'll be an assessment ballot that's sent out to each homeowner in the petition area, and that will lay out for your particular proposed project what's the estimated assessment. And residents will vote either in favor or against at that point in step 4. Non-responses are considered no's, but we encourage everybody to make a vote one way or the other. And then in step 5, the ballot results are tallied up. Do you want to go to the next slide, Rakia? So if the majority is in favor, then we will move the project along to the final design. That's where we'll do the detailed plans, specifications. We'll do advertisement then for construction. We'll perform the construction. Once the construction is completed, and the county will send a letter to everybody saying the sewer is released for service. That's the term we use. Residents will connect. They'll have 9 months to connect from the time that the work is complete. And then the assessments are usually issued at the beginning of the next year following the connection time.
And George, a question about the application itself. The resident asks, for those not in Chartwell, how many neighbors are required to submit an application? This is an independent homeowner not affiliated with a community association.
I think it would probably depend a little bit on how large the area is. We've had contact with some relatively small areas, and we've had contact with some larger areas. I would say if you're adjacent to a neighborhood that might be interested, you would maybe try to reach out to someone in that neighborhood to see, or if you're adjacent to somebody who you think might be interested, to see if you could be added to that potential area. I'm not sure if that's the best answer, but we can probably work with you a little bit more too if you want to try to connect with our team later. But the boundary for the area can be wherever, wherever the kind of there's interest and it makes sense from an engineering standpoint. So we've had some questions. We've only done a handful of these meetings so far, but we have had some questions about what happens to my septic tank. So I just wanted to address this quickly. So the septic tanks have to be abandoned by county code. There'll be new piping that'll go from your house to the clean out that the county's contractor will be installing. The health department has more information on what's required, but for the most part, tanks are usually pumped out and abandoned in place. They're filled in. And this does require the services of a licensed disposal system contractor or a liquid waste hauler. Okay. I do see a question about whether homeowners outside Chartwell get to vote on whether the sewer is connected inside Chartwell. So the projects will be defined by not necessarily whether an area is in Chartwell or outside Chartwell. It's would be the project area that's been defined by whatever collection of homeowners. So in some circumstances, yes, if your project area is, say, 60% people who happen to be in Chartwell and 40% people who are adjacent, but maybe not in the official community designation, if they are in the project area, then that's who gets to vote on that project area. You wouldn't be voting on anybody else's project area. You would only be voting on yours. And now there are economies of scale, so that the larger the project generally is going to be the lower the cost per household. So if several areas were together and there was, say, a project that was 200 homes, you would be voting in conjunction with the other 200 property owners, some of which may not be that close to you physically, but within the same type of drainage area. I hope that answers that question.
Any other questions at this point?
So we know this was a lot of information, but we appreciate all the questions. And Rakia, do we have something about the community webpage, or did you link that in the chat? Oh, okay. Sorry. There. Okay. So just back to the application process. So there's really, as I mentioned, there's just a couple of things that we're looking for with an application. It's a community name. You could even hyphenate it, say if it's this street and that street, just something so that we can give a name to the potential project, who the contact person might be for that area. We can work with you to set up a map. Usually we'll develop the map and send it to you and say, can you confirm this is the area you have in mind? And initial show of community support. And we're very flexible on this. What we're really looking forward is just to see that there's some general interest from the people defined in the map. So it could be from an HOA or a civic association. It could be some sort of online poll that you furnish to us. We've also had some where we just asked really for a show of hands at the meeting. I'm not sure if that's really going to be effective in this setting because there's so many possible different projects. I'm not sure we're going to do that one. But the idea was really just to see that there's some general support based on the information that people have heard so far tonight. And the applications, as we mentioned, we developed a process for applications to help us decide which communities to offer the subsidy to. And that's what we're showing here is the ranking system for that. And you really get the highest points for a number of different factors there. So the total pounds of nitrogen we estimate will be removed, which is directly related to how many homes are involved. Properties in the Chesapeake Bay critical area are projects that include properties in the Chesapeake Bay critical area are given a high rating. If you're in a health department on-site wastewater management problem area, and then we have some cost metrics about the dollar per pound of nitrogen removed, the dollar per house. And so we're going to use these when we get an application. We're going to evaluate these factors, and that'll come up with a ranking system that we can use to decide which communities to offer subsidies to. For those communities that make an application and we don't offer a subsidy in a particular year, we're going to hold on to the applications for 3 years, maybe just confirm that there's still some interest. And then when the next cycle comes around, we'll repeat the ranking process. So hopefully we'll, even for locations that aren't offered the subsidy in the initial cycles, we'll be able to come back to those communities after other projects are completed.
Rakia, why don't you go to the community page while you're asking for questions?
All right.
So we did set up within the Our Water webpage. We've mentioned this a few times. We're calling it the community page. So if you go to the ourwater.org website and you type in your address, you'll get a link to this community webpage that was set up. And what will be on here, we will post this meeting. And I think the slides are on there as well. And so this is a way to go back and listen to some of the information, or if you're talking to some of your neighbors, they can go to this web link and take a look at the information that was presented. They can listen to tonight's recording if they're interested.
George, there is a question here. Is there capacity at existing STP, or are you looking to generate interest to construct new stations? For example, what happened on Eastern Shore?
So, yeah, there is capacity at the sewage treatment plants because most of these areas are in the plan service area. So we take that into account when we're designing the other infrastructure. The capital facility connection charge, which was the CFCC, was mentioned before, that's actually a charge that goes to fund other capital system improvements. Our primary focus here is not really to be building pumping stations. It's to connect the septic systems, and where we can do that without the pumping station, we will try to do that.
Does anyone have any other questions?
Okay, well, I mean, we really appreciate everybody's time tonight. We know this was a lot of information, and just feel free to reach out to us if you have questions about the program or any of the information tonight. All right, thank you, everyone.